Great. Well, good morning and good afternoon, depending on where you are today. We're so excited that you are able to join us. I will say, for those of you who are familiar with Opportunity 360, you already know what an incredible resource it is. For those of you who are new to Opportunity 360, I'm so glad to be able to share one of the things I think is probably most exciting about what we're doing as part of that work. So I just want to say that there are two presenters today. You just heard from Donna Dunlap, but myself, Dr. Tiffany Manuel, and Dr. Andrew Volmert will be talking through some of the findings from the report. So for those of you who want to connect with us on Twitter later, we're going to provide that information for how you can access our contact information. So I'm going to kick us off this morning or this afternoon, again, depending on where you are, and then allow my colleague to talk more specifically about the research that we've done jointly with our colleagues at the Frameworks Institute. So let me just start by saying again, kind of introducing those who haven't been as familiar with Opportunity 360 is that we would love you to be, inviting you to invest a little time in what's on the platform and to look more specifically at all the things that you can get from that. For those of you who know Opportunity 360, you know it as a resource that provides and measures opportunity for almost every neighborhood in the country at a level of scale that is unparalleled. So when you put in any address across the country, you can get a 25-page report that details more than 200 different indicators about what's happening in a particular place. And certainly that's not everything that you can find out about a neighborhood. You can certainly find a lot of information and data online. But what we tried to do with Opportunity 360, especially for housing and community development folks, is to really have a resource that is easy to use, put the address in, and get back at least a basic level of information for every neighborhood across the country. And you'll also find when you go onto that resource that we've organized that information across a couple key things that we know are critical to communities: having mobility, having a sense of health and well-being, having economic security, having access to good quality education, and having, of course, housing stability. So I hope you will check that out. And I would say, just as a matter of sort of wrapping up this initial conversation just about the platform itself, that we are celebrating, hopefully many of you know, our one-year anniversary. So we've only had this resource up on our website for 1 year, but in that 1 year time, we've got more than 100,000 folks on the platform using it, providing their emails to us, downloading data reports, all kinds of things that we know are incredibly useful for improving the communities in which people are trying to work and do good work across the country. So I'm excited to share that with you all. And again, for those of you who are not familiar with the website, I hope that you will become familiar with it because it provides such a wealth of information. So let me just turn my attention to what we're here to talk about today. Today we're going to talk a little bit about narrative and storytelling and information and why it's so important for us to rethink how we've been talking about affordable housing in our neighborhoods and communities across the country. So when we kicked off Opportunity 360 many moons ago, it was created with the radical proposition that we really needed a more comprehensive way, not only just to measure and give you data about opportunity, but to really help people move beyond the traditional ways they even think about opportunity. When people think about what opportunity is, they often think about how hard people are working and the level of perseverance they bring to their own lives and all that good stuff. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? Grit and perseverance are all important, but they often miss some of those structural dimensions, how important it is to have a competent, effective set of housing strategies and a housing delivery system. They often miss how important it is to invest in an educational system that provides educational quality for students. They often miss the more structural things around transit and how people can get to places across their region. They often miss some of these issues around health and well-being and what are some of the things that actually function to provide that. So we knew that we had to do more than just put out data around opportunity. We knew that a part of the conversation would be how do we change, right, the national conversation around opportunity, which is very myopic and doesn't often give us the bandwidth that we need, the broader public support we need to invest in communities in a way that is robust and thoughtful. So one of the things we did was to partner with an organization called the Frameworks Institute. Some of you hopefully are familiar with the work of the Frameworks Institute that does a whole range of things. Certainly Drew will talk a little bit about Frameworks as an organization. But what we did together, or really over the course of 2 years, is together put together what I would call the most comprehensive set of tools for really understanding and trying to advance better housing narratives So if you go to the Frameworks website, you will see a variety of things, just kind of mapping the gap, a whole series of things on peer discourse sessions that my colleagues are going to talk about. And then the most recent set of tools, you can find these on Opportunity 360. You can find the You Don't Have to Live Here report that we did together. And I would say when we wrote that report, you know, there really wasn't a strong acknowledgement about what are the specific things, the sort of backfires that are happening consistently when we go out and talk about affordable housing. And so the point of that was really to sort of just put out there in the universe, so to speak, right, information about what is actually backfiring when we begin to talk about affordable housing, and then what are some of the just general framing principles we know that help to get people up and over some of those backfires. I'm going to talk about that in just a second, but I think for the most part, what's been really helpful is that report that we did jointly together has now become almost a staple in affordable housing, right? It's very seldom that I walk in a room full of housers, and even sometimes outside of housing, and people haven't had a chance to read that material, and they say, oh my God, this is great. Like, this is exactly some of the stuff that we're facing in our communities, but we didn't have a language or way to talk about what we were seeing, or to how to think strategically about how to get people up and over that. So they are appreciative of that work. But we didn't want to just stop there. We could certainly offer kind of general framing advice, right? That's good advice about how you help to get people over some of the, what we might call the dominant narratives, the narratives that do not help us. And those of you who are housers on this call, you know very well what those narratives are, because you get them every time when you announce you're going to provide an affordable housing, or you're going to build an affordable housing unit down the block from the community that is the quote-unquote community of opportunity. You know the folks who come out to those meetings, right, and sometimes shout you down because they don't want that particular kind of development in their neighborhood, right? So we didn't want to just stop there with general framing guidance. We wanted to also provide some additional research, right? When you look specifically across the country, how can we also give in some additional guidance specific to housing that we know can be helpful? So there's some additional resources. Hopefully those of you who are joining us today obviously have had a chance to look at You Don't Have to Live Here. That was the first in the series. And then the latter two, the larger research report and then the Playbook, which just pulls apart, again, some of the more specific findings from the research that Dr. Vollmer is going to talk about in just a second. So I won't talk about this as much. I'll just say, you know, when we think about just thinking about narrative and as we think about these issues, when we look across the sort of core things that are central to opportunity and certainly central to our framework in terms of Opportunity 360, you've got mobility issues, and when we think mobility, we're talking about transportation and transit and those kind of things. You've got health and well-being, you've got economic security, you've got education, you've got housing stability. What's really interesting about that combination of things is housing, I would sort of say, is probably one of the few things where you don't have some basic level of public sort of accountability and responsibility for in terms of how the public thinks about these issues. So, for example, when you think about education, while education may not be great in all neighborhoods, there is a basic sense, no matter who you talk to, that we owe each other, right, some investment in the educational system, that we at very least need to educate our citizenry, that we at very least need to provide some place, right, for our children to go where they learn how to read and write and do arithmetic and those kinds of things. So there is a basic level of public accountability and responsibility for this issue of education. I think the same is true around health. While certainly we don't have a nationalized healthcare system in the way that people would like, but there's a basic sense that if somebody sort of falls out in the middle of the street, right, and they can't, and clutching their chest, and they show up at the emergency room, even if they don't have insurance, we have a responsibility to each other to make sure that that person is at least taken care of in the short term. They may push you back out the door after they patch you up. They won't let you stay in the hospital very long without insurance. But there is a basic layer of responsibility and accountability for this issue of providing health. I think the same is true in terms of economic security and mobility. We have unemployment insurance on the economic security front, and on mobility of transportation. None of us individually are responsible for developing a transit system or a highway system, so there is some public accountability and responsibility there. So those groups have a way to at least begin having those conversations. I would argue that in housing, we do not have that, right? As we're going to talk a little bit about on this call, when you talk to folks about housing and what it is, people don't see a sort of public responsibility writ large in housing. For the most part, people think about housing as a consumer good. It's something you get once it's the reward that comes because you invested in a decent education, you've worked at a job for some period of time, and because of that, you're able to get a decent place to live. And so consistently people said, yeah, I think everybody should have a decent place to live, but it doesn't change how you get there. You get yourself an education, you get yourself a job, and then once you do that, the reward for that is you get to take your paycheck, right, and figure out what you can buy in the open market. And so, you know, again, while I don't want to push too hard on that, I think one of the things we recognize is that we really needed to pull apart this issue of housing and begin to talk about how do you get sort of an attribution of responsibility for housing, for making sure that when people can't afford to live in a region, when they're being priced out, when there is no affordable housing, when people, right, those kinds of issues, that there's some level of public accountability and responsibility that people see when they take those issues on. So that's really, I think, as we started this project, what we were looking for. How do we develop a sense of that, especially when people think about this as a sort of privatized issue that you individually should take? So here's a slide that should come as no surprise to anybody on this call. Building public, well, it is tough. I mean, you see a lot of different kinds of communities. Some communities are in deep distress. Some communities are very high income. Some are getting all kind of luxury condos, gentrification, displacement. I mean, just a variety of different kinds of things happening across the country. But the solutions that we propose as housers is often very difficult to communicate. It's very difficult to talk about the range of issues and solutions that need to be applied for different kinds of communities across the region. It's one of the reasons why we wanted to provide so much data in Opportunity 360, but it just is really difficult to have a constructive conversation about housing as a particular issue. So I certainly don't need to tell you much about that. But one of the things we found, and you saw in the You Don't Have to Live Here report, was just us talking specifically about when we talk about affordable housing, there are a set of narratives, dominant narratives, that challenge, I think, the way that we talk about that work. And when we don't manage those sort of dominant narratives, the backfire happens. And so hopefully many of you on this call are familiar with the slide. The report itself is on our website, but the slide that often, the sort of diagram on the right is one that I hope people recognize, which is there are a number of sort of backfires that come out consistently, almost no matter where you are, whether you're in a high-income neighborhood or even when some of that low-income neighborhoods, talking about affordable housing gets stuck in a whole series of things that often come back at us in ways that are not helpful. That sort of mobility, the one at the top, that sort of personal mobility and responsibility. So if you cannot afford a decent place to live and whatever the options are in our town or community, then you have to move. And there's a huge assumption about that. I often tell folks, if you have any doubt about that, just Google, the word affordable housing and look at any newspaper across the country and then pan down to the comment section, because what you'll find is consistently a set of messages that almost always are about how, part of it is, right, folks are, not being smart with their money and they should stop, relying on the government. There's a whole series of that. But there's also a fairly consistent thing across it around this idea of mobility. If you can't afford to live in whatever town this is, then you have to move. You have to look at that paycheck, take responsibility for what's in it, and find a place, right, for you to go. And again, for us as housers, that's not the response we want. The response that we want to see people take is, that's really not only just unfortunate, it's unjust. And let's figure out together how we provide a set of solutions that means that a whole range of folks with a whole range of incomes have access to the community that we love and want to be part of. I won't go through those. Hopefully many of you have had a chance to go through, talk about that research. I want to sort of begin to pass it over to my colleagues who have really taken on from that point of to backfire conversations, have taken that and done some in-depth research around just a couple pieces of the narrative around affordable housing that have been really tough, but for which we think with a little bit of additional research could really help advocates in the field all across the country bring a new level of, I think, both rigor, right, but also a new level of kind of strategy to how we get people up and over some of the worst parts of this narrative. So I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Dr. Vomert, and let him walk you through what we've done over the past 2 years in terms of our research.
Thanks for that, Tiffany. And I am actually going to hand things off to start to my colleague, Kevin LeVay, a researcher here at Frameworks, who led a lot of this project. So Kevin's going to start by orienting us to the research process that we went through, and I'm going to hit on some of the high points of this research. So Kevin, over to you.
Great, thanks, Drew, and thank you, Tiffany. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to basically pick up right where Tiffany left off and explain what research did we do. So really what went into all of the findings and recommendations that you'll find in the playbook. And so before I do that, I just want to step back and orient everyone towards the general idea of framing. And so Tiffany already talked about the importance of narrative and framing and how to communicate about these issues to building public will. But framing itself, in general, is really just about the selection of certain aspects of an issue in order to encourage a particular understanding of what causes the issue or problem, who or what is responsible for addressing it, and whether and which kinds of solutions are necessary. So I think one thing to kind of keep in mind here, as you'll find from both the playbook and the accompanying research report, is that this research is not your standard marketing or communications research. It's very much informed by social scientific theory and research methods. So we looked at all sorts of different ways of communicating about affordable housing and community development and tested them very rigorously with a plethora of methods from the social sciences. So the research question here was, how can housing and community development be framed to encourage a more structural and collective understanding of people's housing situations and the issues of affordable housing and community development? And of course, to help build support for policies and programs that can make housing and community resources more accessible to all people, regardless of their income. So to answer this question, we conducted several different types of research. So you'll notice in the slide the methods all the way to the left there. Those are some of the more descriptive methods that Tiffany already described that we did in the first phase of research, where we were just kind of charting the landscape of what is this issue about, how do people think about it. Then as we moved forward into the values and other frame tools portion of the side and the explanatory metaphor research, this is where we really get into testing the different frames. So what kinds of frames can build support and encourage a collective understanding around affordable housing and community development, and which are more or less productive than others. So we conducted this part of the research over really the course of a year, maybe a little bit longer. Our team of researchers on staff, which includes PhD level researchers, including myself, who are experts on public understanding, and we come from across the social sciences. So we come from fields as diverse as anthropology. Myself, I'm a political scientist, sociology, linguistics, psychology. And so we developed several different types of frames to test. And the way that we tested this is through several methods. So I want to stress that the research behind these recommendations, again, is rigorous. So it's based on several different things here. So first, it was carried out by a diverse group of experts on public thinking. So again, PhD level researchers from across the social sciences. It included multiple methods. So we test things qualitative and quantitatively. So things like one-on-one interviews, large-scale surveys, and also group-based discussions. All of these things were also tested over a big period of time. So conducted over a period of between 1 to 2 years. So we tested some of the same things and different things at multiple points in time. And we collected data from many people. So across all of the research that we carried out, we had over 9,600 unique participants participating. And then we also had a large diversity among participants in the research. So the smaller scale qualitative research that we conducted took place all across the country. So in Washington, D.C., in Denver, in Cleveland, in Boston, New Orleans, Chicago, and Baltimore. In all of the research that we conducted, we made sure that the participants varied demographically. So we were attentive to make sure that we had diversity among our participants in terms of age, sex and gender, income, education, race and ethnicity, and partisan affiliation, so Democrat or Republican identification. And then in the case of the survey experiments we conducted, we recruited participants to actually match the demographic composition of the U.S. population in terms of all these factors. So the same percentage of people who completed the survey belonged to different groups as exists in the actual population more broadly. So for this particular research, that the findings and recommendations in the playbook are based on, we had 4 different research methods here. So we conducted 4 peer discourse sessions, and these were conducted in Baltimore and Chicago. And these were in-person group-based discussion sessions that lasted for about 90 minutes. And in these sessions, we presented groups with different kinds of values and statistical information, and kind of looked where those things took the discussion and went back and analyzed. We also conducted 63 on-the-street interviews in Denver, Boston, and Washington, D.C. So these were in-person, one-on-one interviews with people simply passing by on the street. And these last for about 10 minutes, and we tested metaphors in these. We also conducted 3 survey experiments. These were conducted online and completed by a sample of about 9,475 people. And so these were people from all across the country. And again, the participants completing these survey experiments matched the general U.S. population in terms of several demographic factors. And then we also conducted 8 persistence trials. So this was a total of 48 people. And these were conducted in New Orleans and Cleveland. And these are in-person, again, group-based discussion activities. And in this case, distinct from the peer discourse sessions, we actually carried forward a metaphor. And in these sessions, we basically looked at how people taught the metaphor itself to other participants. And so as you can see, the recommendations that you'll find in the playbook are backed by several different types of research methods, qualitative, quantitative. They've been tested on a diversity of people, a large number of people, and took place really over multiple points in time. So these recommendations are backed by some pretty solid social science research. So with that in mind, I will now hand it over to my colleague, Drew Vollmert, the Director of Research at Frameworks Institute, and he'll briefly go over some of the recommendations to emerge from all of this research that I just talked about.
Great. Thank you, Kevin. And I will say, so you clearly get a sense from hearing Kevin that a lot went into this, a lot of work, couple of years. This is probably my favorite point in the process of a project like this. As Tiffany mentioned, we work on lots of different issues. And at this point in the process, we finally have a set of clear evidence-based recommendations about how to communicate effectively, which is exciting, and that's what I'm going to focus on sharing with you. So we are more than happy at the end of this to answer any questions you have about the finer point of the research methods, to get into the details. I can always geek out about the specifics, but what I'm really going to focus on here are the takeaways, which is kind of what did we learn from this research about how to communicate effectively about affordable housing. So I'm going to walk through a few of the big highlights here. Not going to be getting lost in the details, because I just want you to get a flavor for some of the big findings that came out of this, and hope that you'll seeing all of this, take the opportunity to dig even more deeply into the research report and the playbook that emerged from the research, which have a lot more detail and further recommendations that I won't be fully getting into. So what you see here are 7 big recommendations that emerge from the research that include recommendations about values frames to use, recommendations about the kind of language to avoid, recommendations about how to communicate about equity issues. I'm not going to touch on each and every one of these, but you can tell from looking at this that there are kind of a few big recommendations that can shape communications on a range of different sub-issues and specific issues. These are big frames that can be used to communicate about all sorts of different things, and we have found to really effectively shift people's attitudes, their understandings, as well as their support for different kinds of policies. So I want to start with how to set the problem. So as Tiffany already mentioned, one of the big things that we found in this research is that thinking about housing is dominated by what we call the consumerism cultural model. So the basic idea is that people think of housing as a consumer good. It's something that you can buy if you have enough money. The price for it is just set by a market. It's just like any other consumer good. And so basically, if you want to have good housing, then you need to make sure you have enough money. And the issue of being able to afford housing is really about making sure, as an individual, we should each make sure that we do what it takes to make sure that we have the money to get good housing, to purchase good housing. So this is where people tend to start. This is what people default to, the kind of assumption that is really dominant in thinking among the American public about the issue. And so obviously this creates lots of problems for getting people to recognize all of the things that need to be done to ensure affordable housing for everyone and for getting people to even recognize this as a collective problem in the first place. There's a specific finding, so I'm going to touch on a number of different recommendations that in different ways get at this issue that challenge this kind of consumerist mindset and shift people away from it. But a big one is at the very basic level about how we even talk about the problem in the first place. So one of the findings, it's a very simple finding, but I think a very powerful one that emerged from the research, is that actually talking about the problem being housing affordability is itself something that cues this consumerist way of thinking. So if we say housing affordability is a major problem for many people in our community, as Tiffany already alluded to, the thing that people tend to take away from this is, well, yep, that is a problem for people, and that's why people need to work hard, they need to get good jobs, they need to do what they can so that they can afford the housing that they want. Or, and this was an interesting finding that emerged from the research, even when people are thinking in a bit more collective and systemic terms, people tend then to think about economic policies. Okay, that's why we need to, raise the minimum wage, make sure people have enough money in their pocket to afford good housing, as opposed to actually housing policy as the solution. But if you shift the frame and you talk instead about housing costs, you use a housing cost frame, our community's housing costs place quality homes out of reach for many people in our community. It's a small shift, but it's an important shift. And when you bring to the fore the idea of cost as the issue, people can recognize that, okay, we're not talking about how much money people have in their pocket, or at least not only that, we're also talking about the cost of housing itself. And we need to make sure that housing is affordable for people. And so this is one example of a small shift in frame that can have big effects on people's thinking. So this is an important piece, but you also have to orient people toward the issue being a collective one in other ways. And one of those ways is with values frames. So when we talk about values, we're talking about basic shared ideals or beliefs that can orient people to why an issue matters. And so we found that there are two values in particular that really are effective on the issue of affordable housing. One of them is the value of fairness across places. This is the zip code argument, the idea that people's outcomes shouldn't be determined by the place they live, by the zip code that they live in. And we found that this kind of argument, this fairness across places argument, is really effective in helping people understand how place and opportunity are connected, and in turn, creating that sense of collective responsibility, that sense of support for community development, particularly in lower income areas. The recognition to help people recognize that this kind of collective action is really necessary in order to ensure that we really do have fairness across places. We also found the value of regional interdependence to be really effective. Again, the idea that the different communities that are part of a region are bound together, their fates are bound together. What benefits one part of the region also benefits another part of the region, the idea that we're kind of all in this together. We found that similarly, this value helped people collectivize the issue. Instead of thinking in these kinds of individualistic terms, the idea that people's housing is really just kind of an individual responsibility and a matter of individual concern, but actually recognizing that community development is something that really is of collective concern and something that we are all responsible for. This kind of argument particularly helps to challenge separate fates thinking, the idea that what happens in one community really isn't connected to what happens in another community. So what happens, in one place, those of us who don't live in that neighborhood don't have to worry about that. That is something that we sometimes heard in the kind of interviews that we conducted, and this value helps to shift people away from that way of thinking. So these kinds of frames are frames that can be used really flexibly in lots of different formats and lots of different channels. And so what you see here are just a couple of examples of how a value like regional interdependence can be used in something as simple as a tweet. So you see a couple of different examples of this value being applied here. One is to talk about, again, how what affects one part of our region affects us all, but then that is applied to the ways in which lower housing costs mean less traffic and cleaner air for everyone. So again, using this idea of interdependence to really pull out the collective benefits on traffic and air pollution. And then in the second case, we see a similar argument being made about the region's economic vitality and how lower housing costs can actually help the economy of a whole region. So we see a couple of different ways in which that same value is being applied in slightly different ways in these two sample tweets. And again, this is just an illustration of the point that these frames really can be applied in many different ways to communicate different specific points and information. All right, I want to turn now to a metaphor that we developed. It's a puzzle metaphor that we found to be really effective in talking about community development. So one of the things that we found in our research is that members of the public generally actually have a very hard time understanding what community development even is, which I know is a little disheartening, but people just get confused about the term community development, but also the concept. People tend to very easily, especially conflate community development organizations with either government or the communities themselves. They don't really understand the distinctive role that community development organizations play. There is sometimes a tendency to conflate community development organizations with for-profit developers. And so there was a need that emerged in this research to find effective ways of talking about community development, how it happens, and what role community development organizations in particular play in that process. And what we found is that there is this solving the puzzle metaphor that is really effective, that talking about community development as a puzzle that requires lots of different pieces, talking about community development organizations as puzzle solvers who can help to bring together those different pieces, whether that's housing or affordable housing or transportation, grocery stores, healthcare, all of the different components that make for the image of a community that allows for well-being for everyone. This is something that, again, this puzzle metaphor was really effective in getting across for people and helping people understand the distinctive role that community development organizations play. One of the other recommendations that emerged from this is that when talking about community development organizations, it's really important to be specific about these organizations being mission-driven, not profit-driven, being accountable to residents, and again, having that kind of distinctive expertise and the distinctive role to play in the process of solving the puzzle of community development. The final recommendation, and this is really a big overarching recommendation that emerged from the research that I want to highlight, is about positioning equity and race in messaging. And the big recommendation is to not just name it, but explain it. So what do I mean by that? One of the things that we found again and again when getting at issues of equity, getting at disparities in housing across different groups, income levels, one of the things that we found is that members of the public really don't understand the sources of inequity. People, again, because they tend to default to individual choices about budgets, about jobs, as the kind of things that drive housing outcomes. Really, people tend not to understand the role of structural factors, systems and policies in shaping outcomes and leading to inequitable outcomes. it's really important to explain how it is that these different kinds of systemic factors and policies lead to different kinds of inequity and different kinds of outcomes. And so really connecting the dots for people, explaining how this process works, proved to be really powerful in shifting people's thinking, bringing to light the sources of different kinds of housing disparities, disparities between communities, so that in conjunction with, again, that value of fairness across places, for instance, which helps people see why it is really important as a society for us to make sure that there is fairness across places, helping people see how that can happen requires bringing into light, into view, the different sources of inequity and, in turn, the kinds of changes that are needed to promote a more equitable situation. So one of the big findings, again, that emerged, and we found this to be true across, whether you're communicating about income, about race, communicating about different issues of equity, explanation is really at the core of an effective framing strategy. And with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Tiffany.
Great, thanks so much. So I wanted to take a moment to talk about kind of where we are with this, sort of using the research and what's ahead, because there's a lot that's involved in this. And again, this is kind of just an introduction for those of you who have not had a chance to read the report. I'm going to flash on the screen in just a moment the website where you can get that information. But the purpose of this is for us to begin to shift the broader narrative and conversation that's happening across the country right now about what people, right, what is the way that we have, what is the responsibility that we have to one another to make sure that we all have a basic level of well-being, and how do we kind of engender that conversation very differently. So there are two parts to this, I think. One is, I think, just being able to, with great facility, use those recommendations. And Frameworks has had a chance to sort of talk through a couple of those, but as you see in the report, there are more than that. And the research report, as Drew can certainly speak to if people want more information, all of the sort of backup and documentation about why those are the recommendations and why they work, right? So not just that this notion that interdependence works, but why it's working, right? And the way in which people talk about how they respond when they get that. And I wanted to say, so just a couple of issues on that. When you get that information, it's important to understand when you look at the test that we did on those values, for example, it's not that the other values aren't useful in some way, shape, or form. And Drew can certainly talk about this. When you look at, we tested a number of different things around values. And values are important because they lift people's sense of that collective responsibility. We all have responsibility to each other. Why? Well, one, because there's interdependence. We all need each other, whether we recognize that or not, and you see that from what works. But there are lots of different values, and being able to test those out with some level of facility is exactly what you heard on the call. But when you hear that, being able to articulate that, being able to embed it is important, and it doesn't mean that you can't use some of the other things that we also tested. We also tested things like communities of opportunity, which is a value that we hear talked about a lot in housing and community development. In fact, when we were starting to put Opportunity 360 together, that was the sort of terminology that we were using. I know a lot of folks are using that terminology. Doesn't mean you can't use that. It just means that as a value, right, it's not strong enough when you look at the qualitative and quantitative research to lift broad public support for what you're trying to do. So you can certainly talk about communities of opportunity, but in terms of the value that primes the conversation is probably not the way you want to lead the conversation. You want to lift that conversation up by talking about fairness across places, that lots of communities across the region, some are doing well, some are struggling, but we all do better when no matter what zip code you are living in, you have access to a decent quality life. And the same thing is true of interdependence. You may think that there are some neighborhoods that are way across town that are not doing very well, and that does not affect you, but it absolutely does, because as a region, right, we function together whether or not we often think about it in those terms or not. So I just want to say, as you're reading the research report, think about it in those terms. We tested out communities of opportunity. We tested out kind of the broader economic benefits argument. We tested out a whole slew of things that you'll see the specifics of, and some of those values actually even push people in the opposite direction. So when they got some of those values, it not only didn't move public support, but it actually reduced public support for some of these issues. And now, because of the research, we understand why, right? When we heard people talk about these issues in some of the peer discourse sessions that Kevin talked about at the very beginning, people talk to us. What's stopping them from being able to connect to some of these affordable housing messages at the very beginning because they were processing it through the lens of consumerism, as we talked about. So anyway, all that to say, as you go through the research report, doesn't mean you can't say the thing you're trying to say. It just means that as you're talking about those things, there are ways to set it up so that you can actually get people to not only hear what you have to say, but then on the other side of it, actually support affordable housing more thoughtfully because you've set that up in a way that you know is consistent with or that addresses some of the dominant narratives that may be challenging for folks. So just a couple things before I sort of open up for questions here. We got a good amount of time to talk a little bit more and to take people's questions is we also know that building public will is not just about framing. The framing is only one aspect of this issue. And I like to tell people when I talk to folks about this work, you are, just because you change your language, you are not going to get people magically all over the world to decide to say, oh my gosh, we've been so silly. Why didn't we support affordable housing? The name of this game is not that you got to get everybody right in your region or in your community to support affordable housing. That's never going to happen. So for those of you who were thinking that we were going to give you the magic phrase to say, and you were going to take that and everybody in the region is going to start nodding their head in your direction, I want to disabuse you of that. That's not what this is. What this is that there are a number of folks who may not sort of in this moment be in your camp. They may not be an affordable housing supporter, but if you engage them in the right way, you can get a lot of them. So you can't get all of them. You're not going to get everybody, right, to see the world in the way that we see, which is that we do have some kind of collective responsibility for thinking about housing in a much more engaged way. You won't get everybody, but you got to get some of them, right? You got to get some of these folks who are right now sitting on the fence, who may not be leaning in on these issues of housing, but we need them, right, to lean in so that we can scale some of these solutions. So framing is not everything. It's not supposed to be a magic bullet, but it's certainly something that we know will help as you incorporate that into a wider range of public building support. Some of you are doing deep-level advocacy. Some of you are lobbying hard on legislators. Some of you are doing door knocking. There are all kinds of things that you all are using as strategies to build public will. And what we're saying is add this issue of framing, being thoughtful about it, and being very intentional about what you're saying so that people on the other side of it respond in the way that you want them to respond. The other thing I'll say is, and this is always near and dear to my heart, is this issue of sort of not just framing these issues, but you all are trying to make a case for a whole series of things. In some communities, you're trying to make a case for anti-displacement strategies. In other communities, you're just trying to make a case for a new homeless shelter. In other communities, you're trying to make a case for inclusionary zoning. So there's a whole wide variety. In some cases, you're trying to provide resources for a housing trust fund and better financing. And there are a whole range of solutions that you're trying to get after. Framing is one part of it, but there's a larger story about how you make the case for those specific things. And I think that's what I think from my vantage point, what's ahead in this work. How do you take the sort of general framing at the top of that and then move people into a space where they can actually support a whole range of things that may be locally specific, that may have any number of challenges in terms of how you move legislators to support those kinds of things, and how do you weave those together so that those strategies are in a good alignment. So I'm actually going to stop now. We have just 15 minutes before the end of the call, and I want to make sure that we have a good amount of sort of robust back and forth from folks who may have questions just about the research itself, who may have questions about how they use different pieces of it, who may have even read the report and know that there are some additional set of recommendations there that they want to have some discussion about on the line. But we wanted to make sure that people had a chance to ask us questions about how to use the research, what it says, and how to think about it moving forward. So, Don, I'm going to ask you to, if there's any questions that have already come in, to go ahead and start us off with those. And if not, you can open the phone lines and we can start to get some of those questions in.
Great. Thanks, Tiffany. And just a reminder, on the slide here that you're looking at, when you go to opportunity360.org, click on the Resources tab, and that will get you to all three of these reports. Our first question is, as a newcomer to intentionally reframing conversations, I would like to know what case studies or historical examples of reframing experts point to as an example of the potential power or impact of reframing.
Sure. Drew, you want to take that on? I can take that too, but why don't you start, and I'll follow you down that path.
Just to make sure I understood it, sort of what are the examples, the historical examples of reframing that show the power, the impact of framing? Is that right?
Yeah.
Correct.
Got it. I mean, there are a lot of them.
I was gonna say, yeah. I was gonna say, Drew, why don't I start with the housing
Go for
example?
it.
And Drew can talk from a wide range of issues. And I would say, for those
Yep.
folks who are advocates around homelessness across the country, you knew that for a very long time it was almost impossible to get folks to put more resources into homelessness. And the reason was, one part of the reason, there are many reasons, but I would say one of the biggest ones, in addition to cost, was because there was this perception that once you provide any level of services for homeless folks, that's going to become a draw for these folks, right? And so once you start to provide resources, particularly to help folks who are experiencing homelessness, that it becomes a draw for those folks. Homelessness is not the only case in which we see that, but that made it almost impossible for local jurisdictions across the country, I would say, to invest in homelessness and strategies to alleviate that. And so one of the things that happened, I know many of you in the homelessness space will know that Dennis Culhane and lots of folks really changed the conversation by talking about supportive housing and by changing the conversation around cost, by looking at how you could change the nature of the cost curve, right, by addressing especially some of these issues of chronic homelessness, that when you took folks in, gave them home, and that was actually cheaper for you to do that, right, than it was to continue to mitigate these issues by having folks show up in jails and hospitals and other places where people tended to land. So I think once that became an example, you saw very quickly across the country advocates begin to try and lean into that as a frame, and I would say as a result, and certainly the Corporation for Supportive Housing and other folks will tell you that has been a major boon to addressing these issues of homelessness. It doesn't mean that they've gotten everything they need. Clearly, there is still a homelessness challenge across the country that we need to mitigate, but changing the way that people thought about that as an issue made a huge difference in terms of resources that are allocated. And I would say once, local governments figured out this was not only the right thing to do, but also the cost-effective things to do, they were able to get on board. And I think framing is a little bit about that, about how you've changed people's perception of it, whether it's around economic issues or economic benefits, or whether it's about a whole range of social benefits that can change the perception of how people think about these issues. So I'm going to pass it on to Drew and say, I'm sure you've got lots of others to add to that conversation.
Yeah, I mean, so there are lots to add. To go, a little further afield. I mean, I think it's interesting if you're looking at the power of framing. It's useful to look, even further back in the past, things that were at the time choices, really deliberate and strategic ones. So some toxic ones. So if you look back in the 70s and 80s about to the introduction of the welfare queen, stereotype, or trickle-down economics as a metaphor for thinking about how the economy works. These are frames that become organizing ways that shape in really problematic and awful ways, right? The ways that people think about government, about the economy. I think more, that something like marriage equality is a really wonderful and powerful example of effective framing that it has, again, as Tiffany was saying earlier, framing is always only one component of social change, but I think you can see the power of framing there. So in the interest of time, I won't belabor things, but we could go on all day about cases where framing has really organized the way that the public conversation and the way that people think about an issue in ways that can either facilitate or really block social change.
Yeah.
Okay, moving on to our next question. What is the value of explaining the historic role that government policy has played in housing inequity, as discussed in The Color of Law, for example? Is there greater value or importance in framing this with certain groups, such as government, philanthropy, et cetera?
Yeah, so I'm happy to start that one, and then Drew, have you chime in on that. I think from our vantage point, I think hopefully one of the things you got out of the report is that we are at a moment in time where we have to talk about issues of equity. I think probably over the last sort of 15 or 20 years, there was often these debates about, the whole range of social issues. Do you have this conversation, particularly about race as an issue, or do you sort of avoid that because you know that it brings up a lot of uncomfortable conversations? And I think the good news, for our industry and I think across the country right now is the appetite, maybe because of the political environment that we find ourselves in. We won't go too far down that pathway, but the political environment we find ourselves in is sort of moving people to this realization that we have to start having a conversation about equity. So it's not just housing. Certainly we need to do something about providing affordable housing, but historically, as you mentioned in the Color of Law and a whole range of them, it's not just, Nicole Hannah-Jones and a whole range of folks who've been talking about these equity issues for many years, that it's time to have that conversation. And I think one of the things in the report that is made very clear is although we have often raised these issues, we have not often done a good job of being very careful about talking about those issues of equity. And not just hear this too, talking about issues of equity and avoiding the ways in which we can unintentionally negatively implicate government. And I want to say that because oftentimes we say government is responsible for a whole range of policies that have negatively affected communities, and then right after that say, but we need government to do all these other kind of things. So just being very careful about how we do that is really important. And I hope in the reports you see that we give some very specific sort of examples of what can be helpful. But I think what the major takeaway from my vantage point, and sure you can add something here too, is that you have to begin to raise up this issue of equity. We cannot continue to not have this conversation. The time is right to have that conversation. The challenge for us is to really be thoughtful about how we raise it so that we don't sort of shoot ourselves in the foot or have a circular sort of firing spot on some of these issues. Drew, anything you'd add to that?
No, I think that was great. I think that's all right on the mark, that addressing the issue head on and explaining. I think this is where the big recommendation about the value of explaining in a careful way, in a thoughtful way, but explaining some of the sources of housing inequity is, I think, really, really powerful and valuable, and something that the research has shows to be an effective strategy.
Mm-hmm.
Great.
Okay, moving to our next question. Do you have any examples or research on, on how images can help reframe the conversation?
Oh, great question. Drew, why don't you take that one?
So that's a great question. In a short bit of time, I can say that this research does not specifically, so we did not test images as part of this research. So that is just true of the research, but images are a critical element of any effective framing strategy. And we tend to recommend that you want to pull images that really correspond with and complement the kinds of frames that we've been talking about. I think the biggest one, the kind of a short version that I want to put on the table in the couple of minutes we have here, is really being attentive to kind of how wide the lens is as you're thinking about the kinds of images that you are using in communication. So recognizing that it's critically important to depict an issue as a collective issue, there is a tendency with images to really focus on individuals. That is a kind of a bias for various reasons in the kind of images that we often use. And the danger there is you actually kind of cue in an implicit way, the idea that this is all about kind of individual choices, and ultimately it's a matter of individual responsibility. So we always recommend looking for images that pan back a bit and really show images of communities in various ways, the different people who are involved. And so I think, especially when we're thinking about images of people, you want to be really careful about images that are too individualistic.
Great.
Okay, great. Our next question, and apologies to the questioner, it's a very long one. I'm going to trim it down somewhat to its very essence. And that would be, how would you create community audiences to share the framing concept, and who should be at the table?
Oh, wow. So I don't know that this research itself is about the idea of how you create community audiences, what we're saying is as you are going about the business of trying to build public support for a wide range of affordable housing strategies, that when you do go out to whomever it is, whether it's to your banking colleagues, whether it's to your developer colleagues, whether it's to your city governance, or whether it's to community-based organizations, that there are some strategies that tend to work across those different groups. So when we tested out this, for example, the value statement, we tested it across a wide variety, Democrats, Republicans, old, such, young, all kinds of issues, African Americans, right, Latinx, everybody, to try and make sure that the recommendations would attend to a wide variety of audiences. Having said that, I will say one of the other parts of the Opportunity 360 platform that I hope you'll avail yourself of is the Listen tools. If you go to our platform and you go to the Listen tool, what you find is a whole set of resources for how you can engage communities in a whole range of ways. So if you have data and you want to go out and share that data, there are ways to do that and platforms that make that easier for you to do than others. If you want to share if you want to map some data that you have, we have a whole resources around that. If you're trying to figure out effective strategies for just telling your story, hopefully, some of the work that we have in the messaging toolkit will help you tell your story, but there's also other platforms that will really help you gather up those stories and do some story mapping, for example. So while the research itself, what we're talking about, is not about how you go out and sort of get those audiences, what I hope you'll find is whatever those audiences are, there are a number of these strategies and recommendations work for a number of different audiences, but also that there are a number of different ways to communicate and engage communities as thoughtful partners in the work with you, and there are a whole lot of resources on our platform that will allow you to sort of think that through.
Great. Thank you, Tiffany. We've only got a couple minutes left. Many people have also asked if the recording and or slides would be made available, and the answer to that is yes. Both the recording and slides will be made available to all participants. We say within 48 hours. It's generally faster than that. We'll be sending a link to the archive, which will contain, again, the link and also a link to the reports as well. And with that, we're almost at time. So, Tiffany, I'm going to turn this back over to you to wrap us up.
Great. So I want to just first of all say thank you to our colleagues at the Frameworks Institute who we work with on this project. It's been an incredible labor of love that really started from our initial journey, just we were sort of figuring out kind of how to talk about this very thorny issue of opportunity and running into these conversations that were always about how individual people should manage their money better and they should work a little bit harder. And we went, yeah, there's some of that. Certainly we don't want to let folks off the hook. There's a lot, right? There's a lot all of us could do to work harder and have more grit and perseverance and all of that. But we wanted a way to be able to really outline a bigger strategy for helping people to see some of the more structural issues that are consistent in how people think about opportunity as a frame and how that helps us to build support, especially for this issue of affordable housing, where there really isn't, as I talked about at the top of this call, as much of a sense of collective accountability and responsibility for what we owe to each other because we are all members of this society. So I hope that, again, I'm glad you're able to join our call. For those of you who were able to stay to the end, thank you very much. And, again, I hope you will avail yourselves of the resources on our platform. There is a measure tool for those of you who are data wonks and want to know all the data. And we're always happy to provide demos and additional things to help you expand your understanding of how to use those resources. So connect with us, and we're happy to talk to folks about the Measure platform. The set of Listen tools, which are about community engagement, how you engage a broad range of stakeholders in your community around a broad range of issues. So I hope that for those of you who are trying to do deep and thoughtful community engagement work, engaging your communities as partners, right? Not just as folks you inform about, right, what you think should happen, but how do you help people to participate in the process as partners? There's a whole lot of discussion of that in our Listen tool. A partner tool, which allows you to put in a zip code and find relevant partners in the region across sectors. So if you're in housing, you should be reaching across the aisles, and many of you I know are. But a tool that allows you to find folks in the healthcare sector, in the transportation sector, in the food insecurity sector, across, et cetera, that you can be working with at the local level. And then some resources around our Evaluate tool that just allow you to think about the social return on the investment that you're making in places. So I'll stop there, and I will just say thank you so much again for your time. Definitely check out the website and all the resources that we talked about here, and happy to engage in the discussion more for those of you who want more information. Thank you so much, and have a great, grand, and awesome day.